Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first session of the Illusion Chamber Unreality Laboratory 1. This seminar will function as an immersive laboratory that studies 15 varying chambers of illusion: dream, nightmare, mirage, hallucination, fantasy, figment, spell, simulation, story, vision, rumor, superstition, miracle, game, and lie. As we enter an age of virtuality, multiverses, inorganic life, and artificial intelligence, it becomes increasingly urgent to trace the long, winding, and multifarious histories of illusion across time. From manuals of ancient alchemical circles to the prophetic episodes of medieval mystics, from narcotized poets to horror filmmakers, from contortionists, puppeteers, and circus performers to cosmetologists and mask makers, from documented instances of mass hysteria to the secret languages of twins, from the folklore of shape-shifting beings to museums of optical, auditory, tactile, ambiguous, physiological, and cognitive illusions. Each week's discussion will rotate around the seminar participants' select findings as they bring whatever intricate, rare, and obscure examples from around the world to form an archive of the unreal. These examples can be derived from almost any region, era, genre, and medium, so long as they experiment with the illusory category in question: mythology, literature, philosophy, anthropology, film, visual art, music, theater, dance, architecture, design, technological devices, video games, underground movements, legends, strange objects, ecological phenomena, biogenetic or perceptual distortions. Together, these samples will form their own display cases in an unparalleled collection, fragments that chart the many techniques at work across each rung of Unreality's ladder. If the surrealists of 1924 wrote in their Revolution Number Manifesto that we are all at the mercy of the dream, then our 2024 lab will reverse this logic to claim now that all dreams are at our mercy. The seminar is run by Jason Mohaghegh, who's an associate professor of comparative literature at Babson College. His scholarly focus is upon tracking currents of experimental thought between the Middle East and the West, with particular attention to exploring the concepts of chaos, violence, illusion, silence, madness, futurism, disappearance, and apocalyptic aesthetics. He has published several books to date, including The Chaotic Imagination, New Literature and Philosophy of the Middle East, Inflictions, The Writing of Violence in the Middle East, The Radical Unspoken, Silence in Middle Eastern and Western Thought, Insurgent Poet, Mystic, Sectarian, The Four Masks of an Eastern Postmodernism, Elemental Disappearances with Dejan Lukic, Omnicide, Mania, Fatality, and the Future in Delirium, and Night, A Philosophy of the After Dark. He's also the co-editor of the Suspensions book series with Bloomsbury Press and the co-director of the Fifth Disappearance Lab. Jason, the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Ishita. So, as she described, this entire seminar runs on your shoulders, essentially. Beyond this first session, you're all going to be sent out into various atmospheres on a scavenger hunt to come back and form a collector's row. So every week, you'll be posting 2 examples from whatever genre, whatever period, whatever cultural backdrop, whatever aesthetic. It can be, again, ecological, it can be something in media, it can be something literary or poetic, it can be visual, that plays or experiments in a unique way with the type of illusion that we're exploring for that week. So if we're in the week of nightmare, if we're in the week of mirage, if we're in the week of rumor, right, or of lie, you have to go find something somewhere. And there's a format that's given. Ishita will send all of you the link after this seminar where you will upload your entries. This is your only work. There's no final project. There's no presentations. Every week you come with 2 examples from the 2 categories. So the first week for next week is dream and nightmare. You find me 1 dream, you find me 1 nightmare. These can be ancient myths. These can be futuristic virtual reality experiments. These can be anything in between, right? Anything goes. Just the only logic is fascination. The most astonishing, the most rare, the most obscure, the most spellbinding. And you come ready, and everyone come ready to do 2-minute presentations, 2 to 3 minute presentations about them, micro glimpses. I'll just go around. I'm not going to lecture beyond this first session. We're going to start sort of hitting the ground running by just me saying, Benito, Megan, Isabel, what's your example? You read it to us in the entry, and you discuss what you find particularly cunning or sort of astonishing about it. And we move from there and we unravel that. By the end of this, the project is for us as between almost 60 people. If everyone participates, we're going to have an absolutely immense archive. I mean, we're going to have a staggering collector's room of examples. Who knows what we can turn that into? There's already thoughts of how we could actually develop that into something very intriguing once it's done. But I want to see how it plays out, the choices that are made. So just follow your sensitivities and instincts. There's no right answer. There's only interesting answers. And come back and surprise us with whatever you want to find. So, and even beyond that, because I want you to spend the time researching the thing that you discover and looking into it, there are no real readings. Now, I have put a series of readings, Ishida has uploaded them, that you can use and that you can read on your own if you'd like to. But I want this to be more active. Again, this is a laboratory atmosphere, right? So I need you working sort of. So I want you to go out there and to be finding these different sightings, these different discoveries, and to bring them to the forefront. And I'm just going to play the role of the listener and the interlocutor. So every week when I say, you know, Yana, what did you find? And she shows me something, I'll offer a few impressions from there. And we can continue to refine the entries until we're done at the end of 8 weeks. Now, this seems like a playful, sort of whimsical exercise. But to me, honestly, I've been in the game of whatever you could call this thing that we do. You know, if you want to call it philosophy, if you want to call it theory, if you want to call it writing, if you want to call it existence, whatever it is. Been in it a while, and long enough to have sore bones and enough scars to say that I actually think that in a time of emergency, in an hour of exceptional despair, when the killing fields are again becoming the very signature of reality, illusion is the most severe and most dangerous concept. I think it is our responsibility, and I'm ashamed and disgraced continually by how our kind, and by our kind, I mean whatever that instinct is that binds all of us on a Sunday, a random Sunday, in the middle of nowhere, wherever you're living, to gather here. There is some consistency, there is some molecule of continuity that brings us here when no one else in the world wants to do this but us. But our kind fails continually to weaponize its magical abilities. We lose constantly against reality. And the reason is because, and it's always been a tough question, what do artists have to say about politics? What do philosophers have to say about politics? And you notice that it usually goes wrong. The surrealists and existentialists became Stalinists. Many of the futurists became fascists, right? Why do they go wrong? And I think it's because, and this is my own most genuine stance on this, and I'm not going to talk much politics in this class, but the political implicates us whether we like it or not when there are children being killed in the world. I think we don't understand our purpose. Our purpose is to exterminate reality. By that, I mean the reality principle, not what you would call physical reality, not the world. The very idea of reality needs to be undone. And there's no political ideology on earth that I know, especially in the modern period, that would ever say that. The fatal flaw, I would say, in every one of those isms that I mentioned, capitalism, fascism, Stalinism, whatever ism you want to sort of throw yourself in with, is that they all believed in themselves. They were all reality principles, ultimately. So if we ask ourselves how these idealistic, utopian, enlightened sort of things could become genocidal war machines, it's because of, I think, an underlying reality principle that's at work. Now, what does that mean exactly? It doesn't mean that illusion, if we're mobilizing illusion as a state of war, this doesn't mean that we're falling into a dialectical quicksand. Because for me, illusion is not the opposite of reality, even if it destroys it. Rather, illusion is entirely foreign and irrelevant to the concept of reality. It has nothing to do with it. It is unstrung from its language games and ideological traps in the same way that a non-cancerous body is not defined as an anti-cancer system. It just means that you are not riddled with the terrible disease and its deterministic symptoms. You follow? I think illusion has nothing to do with the real. It has nothing to say with the real. It can't even fathom the self-oppression of what we call reality. Imagine like an alien intelligence standing dumbfounded at a race of planetary slaves. I don't think illusion can understand why reality would do this to itself. Now, the avant-garde, what we call the avant-garde, I summoned their ghosts earlier, very bravely once called illusions to war. But they failed, not because they went too far, but because they didn't go far enough, if you ask me. They didn't truly ask this dangerous question. What would thought look like without any formulation of reality? What would knowing mean? Imagination, consciousness, self, without any recourse to something called the real. How treacherous and dangerous would our dreams be if there was no waking, or if we didn't believe in ourselves? I believe that when you align yourself with a reality principle, philosophically, a truth principle, you inevitably fall into a totalitarian slope. But I don't think that illusion is constrained by any patterns. It's kaleidoscopic, it's metamorphic, it's a carnival of all possible worlds. So just because we say we align ourselves with illusion, it's not the same as, again, an ideological trope or an anthem or a banner of some kind. Now, the important thing I want to start with as a concept then with all of you, we go back to 1918, 6 years before the Surrealists' first revolutionary manifesto. And who is the elder philosopher in the wings that inspires Surrealism and the great rupture of the avant-garde? It's actually, of all people, a very conservative scientist named Freud. Sigmund Freud writes Totem and Taboo in 1918. And in that book, he attempts to get to the bottom, the originary moment at which primitive consciousness or primitive psyche becomes modern psyche, becomes us, this wretched thing that we are, the knowing subject. And nobody reads this very closely. They read other things, they highlight other principles of his, but it's very rare that I've heard anybody attribute what for Freud the actual boundary is, the boundary of the knowing subject, between the knowing subject and this primitive state of innocence. And for him, it's called the omnipotence of thought delusion. Savages, children, and obsessive compulsive neurotics all share a problem for Freud, a defect, and he is judgmental about this. They overestimate that thought can effectuate transformations in reality itself. That by mere thinking of something, wishing of something, projection of an idea from the mind, you can actually manifest changes in external reality. Now remember that Freud actually is the inventor of the term reality principle. That's a synonym or code word for the superego, the world of laws, structures, regimes, moralities, religions, cultures, society and their logics, right? Power dimensions. And you have to remember that Freud ultimately sides with the reality principle. Now, what does because he thinks that civilization, as grotesque as it is, as authoritarian as it is, and he sees that coming as well, by the way. Freud is brilliantly prophetic in seeing the horrors of the 20th century on the horizon. He still thinks it's better than the jungle. He cannot advocate for a return to the forest, a return to the fairy tale, a return to the carnivals and festivals of ancient peoples. He's disturbed by the imbalance of the omnipotence of thought that he sees in savage peoples who believe with magical rituals, right, that they can sort of superstitiously make things, evoke things in the world around them, right? So savages use sorcery, children use pretending, and obsessional neurotics use little rituals around the house, washing their hands 17 times, locking the door 28 times. He also, Freud says, art partakes of the omnipotence of thought delusion because it's someone who tries to wrest an image out of their mind, out of their consciousness, and present it and make it in the world. So there's even an element of that in the very essence of art. And he says phobias are aligned with this. People who are afraid of things and have kind of irrational paranoia, they also believe in a negative sense that, oh, if I do this too many times, something awful or catastrophic will happen to me, right? So thought becomes, again, overvalued. And psychic activity becomes sort of, you have too much belief in the power of your own psychic activities. But Freud doesn't consider another prototype. Forget children and savages and obsessive compulsive figures. He doesn't consider what I actually want all of you to become this semester. He doesn't consider addicts. Interestingly, Freud himself was an addict. He was a cocaine addict. But he didn't ever really formulate a very powerful psychological proposition on the addict. Now, there's a reason for this. He disdains intuition and manifestation principles. Now, this is a little complicated. Just follow me on this. Philosophy is the one genre of creative activity that has never been able to be sold well by capitalism. So capitalism took architecture, turned it into a trillion-dollar industry, took fashion, took cooking, right? Took literature and turned them into bestsellers, took film, right? Took visual art, right? Held all of these aesthetics hostage and prostituted them to the highest bidders of a global geopolitical economic order, right? Not philosophy. Philosophy is a waste of capitalism's time. It has very little use value. It has very little instrumental or exchange value in marketplaces until they figured out a way. They dumbed it down and they created the #1 best-selling genre in the history of books, New Ageism. So if you go to any Amazon website or you go to any bookstore, the disproportionate number of books being sold are books that are about finding your true self and unlocking your powers and visualizing, your future and your destiny and all of these types of things. New Age kind of pseudo-mysticism, right? The kind of fast food of mystical philosophy that's full of simplifications and reductionisms and leaps of silly logic and all of that. And opportunistic entrepreneurs trying to, convince you that wealth and luxury and fortune are things that you can will in a way that would make poor Nietzsche, cry in his grave if he knew that's what the idea of the will had turned into. But Freud hated, first we have to ask why it's so popular. Second, we have to ask why Freud hated this idea of manifestation so radically that it was the cause of his break from Carl Jung. When Jung started looking at intuition, that's when Freud thought that he was involved in kind of black magic experimentation and had no interest in it. Now, I want to get back to this idea of the addict. Why? Because addicts aren't transcendent sorcerers. They're not strange recluses on the mountains. They're in the street. You cannot get someone who is more materially embedded in the real, in the everyday, than the junkie. Because the junkie is out there hustling in every alleyway, trying to score, getting their hands dirty, intersecting, networking, wandering the streets. You follow? This is why I want to take illusion, but in search of what? In search of a weird sensation that is illusory. You follow? willing to steal, willing to commit violence, potentially, willing to break laws, willing to starve themselves or sleep in the cold in the street. Right. Now, what interests me about the addict is not their tragic circumstances often, or the downward spiral that takes place, or even the point at which pleasure becomes pain, which is an inevitable threshold in addiction, becomes need and then becomes a neurotic thing. It's the fact that addicts know something very smart that Freud didn't quite understand. Freud thought that the omnipotence of thought delusion was a magical thinking exercise where you just made these absurd jumps that if I just think this enough times, or if I do this sequence, or if I engage in some sacred geometry or something like that, some event will manifest itself. No, the addict understands that to score your object of desire that night, whether it's a substance, whether it's some type of item, whether it's some type of experience, whatever the phenomenon is that you're in search of, it rests upon a very fragile and volatile set of circumstances. You go to one dealer, they're out that night. They fling you towards another geography of the city, another district. Someone they've heard has that thing that you're looking for. Do you follow? You're chasing phantoms. And it's a very mercurial, nebulous, frail balance that you're trying to negotiate. It's a tightrope walk because you're having to adapt continually, right? All the people that you also are networked with who are insiders and intimates of a certain forbidden or illicit world, they also could betray you very easily. There's no overarching moral code necessarily there. So it's dangerous every time you go out into the street. But what are they doing, essentially? The word score, they're trying to score. I use the word score because score has both the precision of a mathematical term, right? To score. So there's something computational, something algebraic about it in its precision, but it also has the indeterminacy of games. The score is at the heart of a game, right? So between math and game, interestingly. And by the way, that is the very definition of games of extreme skill, right? Games of extreme skill are figures who can master probability and at the same time realize there's an element of chance. So they hang out, like I said, in certain areas of the city. They look for certain figures in the street. They place themselves in the right position to maximize likelihood and probability. That is what you are doing for the next 8 weeks. It's not going to be accidental. You're going to go searching. You're going to throw yourself down rabbit holes, and you're going to maximize the potential that you get lucky in the game of illusion. Does that make sense? In a way, it's a certain orientation and sensitivity. You can put yourself in the right position to inherit a windfall, right? So we have to follow the addict here, and there's one other reason. Does anybody know what the opposite of the reality principle is for Freud? The pleasure principle. And what is the addict if not a servant to the god of pleasure? All they look for is pleasure. And why is it that pleasure matters to us in this session of ours? Because no matter how visceral, sensorial, material pleasure is as an experience, it does belong to the domain of illusion based on two philosophical definitions. One, pleasure has no meaning. Reality principles are always about meaning. Pleasure doesn't have meaning. Go read Bataille on eroticism, and you can find that. Go read Artificial Paradises, go read Baudelaire. Pleasure is not about meaning. It's about the euphoria of a meaningless universe, right? A fleeting impulse, a sensation, a quick desire, an encounter in the middle of the night, right? A trade with a stranger. None of this is about meaning. And two, the other law that goes against reality principles, pleasure is impermanent, right? Every single genocidal dictator of the 20th century who was behind every single fatal ideology believed they would last forever, were trying to create a utopia that would last forever. They were trapped entirely in mythologies of permanence. That is at the heart of every reality principle. The end of history delusion. Impermanence isn't that. It's a quick meanwhile. It's an interlude, right? It's a one night only encounter. So for that reason, pleasure and illusion are going to have a lot to do with one another. Now, real quick, if you were to read psychiatric journals, which I don't recommend, but I do that sometimes, it's good to know some of the moves and maneuvers of your enemies. But if you read psychiatric journals, they will very brilliantly compartmentalize things. Sometimes it's helpful, but it's always funny where you see they stop in their logic, where they don't develop the ideas further because that would threaten their edifice. So here's one. For the longest time, for 100 years, psychiatric journals have divided delusion, which is a stepsister of the word illusion. They're different, but let's just say this. So they've divided delusions into possible versus impossible delusions. So if Paige were to come to me and say, I believe that my sister is trying to poison me, that's a possible delusion. Poison exists, her sister exists. But if she were to come to me and say, I believe that aliens are transmitting messages through metal in my teeth, that's an impossible delusion, as far as we know at this point in history, right? So this becomes an interesting thing. But what they never talk about is, what's the bridge delusion? How does one escalate? Because you know that most people who go so-called mad, most forms of psychosis or pathology or delirium begin with possible delusions that then jump to impossible delusions eventually. The interesting question for us to figure out is, what's the bridge delusion, right? How do you go from seemingly quasi-logical but disturbed kind of suspicions and paranoias about your everyday reality to outlandish cosmological, like gods are manipulating things behind the scenes, conspiracy level delusion? Those bridge delusions are something that psychoanalysis never wants to unlock because it turns their patients into lost causes. That's when you lose them in the room and they become institutionalized, right? And notice that this is the case for even the first warden of the first asylum. Go back and look at Freud's master, Dr. Charcot, who presided over the Salpêtrière Institution for Hysterical Women, and he had a lost cause wing. He placed some of them in the category of those who were incurables, right? So that's at the heart of even the history, the very malevolent history of psychoanalysis. Like, what causes him to write them off? What makes them irrecuperable beyond the point of no return? It's precisely that they cross that bridge from possible to impossible delusions. Well, we want to walk that bridge. In fact, we want to set our tents and our camp on that bridge this semester. Now, having said that, one last way of thinking about this is that I always like using paradigms of carnivals and circuses and masquerades, but I actually want us to think more militaristically this semester about illusion. So I want you to think of yourselves as part of the control room. A control room is a very particular site, right? You can imagine the screens before you, the buttons, the switchboards. It's the epicenter or the headquarters of an exclusive faction that actually can run the machinery of something as divergent and as sort of weirdly heterogeneous as a world of illusion. So you're in the control room, which means that you have to be willing to not surrender yourselves to awe. You have to be on top of this as overseers, as constructors, as architects of the awe, which means that when you find an illusion in the world, I want you to enhance and accentuate its radical implications. So when you go out this first week and you find me anything you want about dreams, it can be folklore from indigenous tribes, it can be an image from some strange elusive figure in some other country, whatever you want, and you bring it back, I want you to find the detail, to find the sort of the equation at the heart of it that makes it, that projects it towards its outer limit, most sort of dangerous potentiality, that which could threaten reality itself. All right. Now, by the way, Ishida knows is that in the document that she has created, where you have the section, so you'll see dream and nightmare, you're just going to put your entry. There's a format that is already established there. It just says, give me the time, the location. So you might write Bulgaria, 1834, right? Something, or and then something about it, and then the description, something about vampire castles, you know, sort of in Eastern Europe at that time period. And again, anything goes. I don't know how many times I can say this, but if you want to look at the history of gunpowder and fireworks, if you want to look at the aesthetics and the architecture of casinos and poker rooms, if you want to look at wonder chambers, obscure video games, mask makers, cosmetologists, alchemists, sleep caves, haunted houses, drug poets, horror films, contortionists, puppeteers, miracle workers. There was a great form of con men who went around the country promising they could bring rain in the 1920s and 30s in times of drought. Secret languages of twins, folklores of shapeshifters, museums of illusion throughout the world. Wherever you want to go is fair game. Just come ready to play each time. So let me give you a quick example here, now that we've come this far. So we just covered sort of the 5 principles: illusion as war, omnipotence of thought. We have to figure out what this means to restore this. And weirdly enough, I don't want to go too heavy on this point just yet. But if for Freud, the dividing line between the child's consciousness and adult consciousness is the movement from omnipotence of thought to reality principle, meaning the child thinks that if it wishes something when it blows out the candles on its birthday cake, that it will happen. And the adult does not believe that. The adult is infused with a kind of cynicism or disenchantment or a pessimism about the limitations of their own thought processes. We have to figure out how to restore the omnipotence of thought delusion. That's our only help, or our only hope. This becomes dangerous if I actually prescribe this to you, because do any of you know that if Jean Baudrillard is the architect of the philosophy of simulation, which is the greatest diagnosis of our age. I don't care what anybody wants to say in this cool chic, like it's passé now. No, we give respect and we bow at the thrones of great masters. Baudrillard's theory of simulation gave us a new language to understand. So did Freud's, by the way. The theories of the unconscious gave us a new language. However much I may count him as an enemy, there is awe in front of the inventiveness and the usefulness of his school. But if Baudrillard gave us the idea of simulation, do you know what his antidote to simulation is? It's in his book called Seduction. He believes we almost become seducers in order to break the spells or counteract the age of simulation. Now, seduction is very close to the concept of illusion that we're going to develop. But what that means is seduction is a one-on-one process. Unlike ideology, ideology moves in mass formations. You can think of the marches of Hitler. You can think of the gulags. You can think of just immense bodies of even capitalism, the way that it mobilizes sort of entire sweatshops, entire resources sort of across worlds and across territories. It's always about collective actions. Seduction is a one-on-one encounter. Think of the devil. Meets you one night when no one else is looking, when no one else is around, and has a private conversation. Baudrillard thinks that the guerrilla resistance that we must mount in the age of simulation are going to be these individual incisions, seductive incisions that we make, where we tempt someone to forfeit the reality principle. Now, in the world of addicts, we have a word for that. It's called the dealer. The dealer is that deviant who tells you, I know you're a lawyer in the suburbs, I know you got a wife and kids, but I just need half an hour with you in the back room, take you on a ride, transport you elsewhere. And you've contaminated their reality matrix at some level. Baudrillard wants to turn all the things that you guys prize, what you call philosophy, what you call art, what you call literature. He wants to, we call thought, our kinds of thought, not banal, mundane, instrumental, everyday thoughts, the kinds of thought that we're doing here. He wants us to turn them into agents of seduction, instruments of seduction, the way that a dealer uses a drug. Okay, to do that, though, first we have to understand what we're selling, which is why I've provided this breakdown. Now, this is not a perfect, comprehensive breakdown of the entire catalog of illusion types that exist in the world, but it helps us differentiate to say that in week 1, we're going to look at dream and nightmare, week 2, mirage and hallucination, fantasy and figment, spell and simulation, stories and visions, rumor and superstition, and in the final week, miracles, games, and lies. This helps us have a slight level of acuity, to be more acute and more exact in our orchestration of things and in our compartmentalization of things. Because any collector's room is about the taxonomies that they create. And there's a reason for that. Each of these harbors slightly divergent potentials. So, just to give you a quick example, some of you may know this, that this image of a horrifying feminine figure named Loab is something that now currently haunts internet channels. I don't know if you're aware of this, but it starts appearing in unexpected latent spaces, AI image generators. Suddenly the face of this woman will come up when people put prompts in for random things. They'll look for a landscape of the ocean, and Loab's face will suddenly appear. Now, this, what's called a cryptid, was created by the negative prompt of an online user named Supercomposite. This figure, now what's a negative prompt? This is what's interesting. It didn't give a prompt to the AI image generator saying, show me the face of a hideous person. Instead, it said something positive and then wrote negative prompt. Show me beauty. Show me perfection. Now, he's never, Supercomposite, he or she has never unveiled what exactly the prompt was. But it was supposed to be something elegant and positive, and then just they put in parentheses at the end, negative prompt. And this emerged. And he writes in the corner, or she writes in the corner, Supercomposite writes, I discovered this woman who I call Loab in April. The AI reproduced her more easily than most celebrities. Her presence is persistent and she haunts every image she touches. Take a seat. This is a true horror story and veers sharply macabre. Now, what's interesting now that they're trying to study is that this generator programs, they're now producing this random physiological anomaly in scattered places. And this almost sort of involuntarily, it's spasming and projecting this out, which makes us wonder, I mean, if Freud were alive, he might wonder whether AI has an unconscious then, because it seems to be lurking in a certain sort of way. But what I'm interested in then here is, and this is what you're going to do in your entries, at the end of your description where you talk about whatever, so you would talk about how she's scattered to the corners of our virtual universe, how her silhouette is being projected, what that means, how this anomaly could happen, whatever, 3 to 5 sentences of your entry. At the end, I want a question. And that question is a provocative connection between illusion and another concept. So for here, we might say, how does illusion connect with the experience of paranoia? Okay, something to that effect. All right, or it could be anything else. This is something that I'm actually going to this week. This is a puppet theater production of Moby Dick. It features a 7-foot-tall Captain Ahab marionette. He paces in brooding circles in midair while raving doomsday prophecies. He talks about the fanaticism of drifting into the waters. And you actually have an actual scale white whale puppet that consumes the entire stage when it makes its final appearance. You see it on the right. The lighting is faint to reflect periods of extended moonlight. You're supposed to be on these long, misty nights on the sea and feel the blackness of the watery depths. You can see the hammocks there. My favorite element of this is that there's also a drowned orchestra. So the orchestra is composed of drowned individuals, supposedly, who play sort of ocean soundscapes, storms, whale songs, and they manipulate low-toned instruments to show the captain's gradual spiral into insanity. Anyway, and then you get the eventual shipwreck. These are just examples. Here's another one. In 2018, you have a figure named Sax Afridi, who's a relatively well-known visual artist. You have a fictional archaeological display he called the Space Mosque. These were artifacts from a supposed sighting of a space mosque. Now, I've seen a lot of hyperstition things like this sort of going around. They can be very interesting. A lot of people are doing it, but what intrigues me about this one in particular is not just that sort of the architectural elements of a floating dome and a minaret, sort of and all that, is that the idea behind it, the story behind it, was that when it appeared, it started granting the prayers of anybody within its vicinity. Okay, now what's interesting about that is wish fulfillment, as Freud called it, is at the heart of the omnipotence of thought delusion, right? The idea that wishes could be actually fulfilled. And by the way, Lacan will take it into a more terrible dimension than that, which is, for me, true most of the time, but not true in the most interesting and rare moments of experience. Lacan thinks all wishes and desires are doomed to dissatisfaction and incompletion because we misunderstand ourselves. And that's why he never read people like Antonin Artaud, because there are a few weird breeds out there who know exactly what they want from this world and know how to get it. And man, when they slam into it and they acquire it, right, as Artaud says, and whatever I do not have, I create for myself. That's the sound, that voice is the sound of one of Pharaoh's ancient sorcerers, right? And that's nothing that a neurotic psychoanalyst wants to deal with, right? They want to think it's a doomed process. You'll never get your wish. And even if you get your wish, haha, you've been ambushed by your own sort of misunderstanding, and you become broken sort of by the world yet again. There is no joy. Yeah, if you hang out in Paris with the wrong types, you're going to see that repetitive orchestration. That is 99% of what Nietzsche calls the all too human. What we are interested in this semester is the 1% that somehow figure it out. This is what even Jung allowed for a possibility of when he called it synchronicity. Synchronicity being the moment when an inner thought, wish, image, desire suddenly echoes in external reality. And he says, when that moment happens, when something that you wanted or thought could happen actually happens, by luck, he doesn't think it's miraculous, by luck, by circumstance, by a certain turn of fortune, it is a sensation of exhilaration and invincibility like no other. When the inner and the external world actually collide smoothly, sort of, and collude with one another. So anyway, what's interesting here is that this space mosque, supposedly, according to the thing, started granting wishes. But very quickly, he says that that created a kind of mafia market of prayer granting. And all of a sudden, we had this catastrophic result where there was greed, corruption, death wishes, people using it for the wrong reasons, because human nature is negative, he claims, by its intrinsic orientation. And then the spaceship vanished. But while it left, it erased the memories of those who had witnessed its power. So that's the second miracle. Not that it just appears, that it disappears and exits our planetary orbit. But it leaves relics behind, illegible relics. That intrigues me because part of the way, the methodology, the covert methodology that all of you have to use from week to week is to go searching for relics. It's hard to chase mirages. It's hard to follow lies, right? Because they dwell in that halfway zone, right? That middle zone between presence and absence, where you can be equally misled, right? In that mystery kind of sight. But that's exactly what we have to do. So sometimes you'll find relics and you just have nothing but an intuition again, or what Blanchot called a mood, a sense of mood that this is something left behind that tracks itself to something else. And there are a million other examples that I'm not going to get into today because I want to do something else with you. But, you know, even well-known popularized versions of this. In New York City, there was a kind of ingenious in what they called environmental theater exhibition called Sleep No More, where you would arrive at a warehouse. It would resemble a kind of decadent Art Deco lobby called the McKittrick Hotel. You had these eerie guides who would appear. They'd greet you and ask you to wear these white masks, something out of like Eyes Wide Shut, kind of, you know, sort of aristocratic secret society bird mask, something like that. I've been to this. And you go into an elevator, they take you into another floor, and then you have a maze of these dim lit, foggy corridors. You can go in whatever direction you want, through hallways, rooms, and you go into the rooms, you can touch things, you can go through drawers of people in the room, cabinets and all of that. You're free to touch the objects of any zone. While actors, every once in a while, the actors will gather together and stage a disruptive scene before your eyes and then leave. You don't have to watch them, you can keep going. Now, the interesting thing is that they split you up from your friends when you get there. So you're all in different groups and you're led in different, and no one has the same experience then because it's spatially massive enough that you only will ever see maybe one-fifth of the rooms in the place in the hour or so that you're given to wander. So when you go to compare notes, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't cohere, which is interesting because it doesn't allow for a synthesis, a perceptual synthesis in the end. But you play a kind of voyeur, a perfect voyeur. You can see everything. You can go everywhere. There's a room of the herbs of a mad collector of fragrances. You can smell the herbs in that room. You can go into a child's bedroom and play with their toys, right? And at the end, then finally, in the last sort of thing that happens, all of the guards of the McKittrick Hotel or the employees, they stand in front of the different hallways and they force you into a collective space where you all behold a grand spectacle. I won't tell you what that is. That's the only thing that is unifying. Okay, you can go on and on. There's a group of young, very interesting Russian and East European women who put together a conference called Infrastructural Horror. You can see this. They say in the 19th century, a ruin was a landscape for Gothic horror. Today, monsters pervade infrastructure. And they look at the technological infrastructures of sort of abandoned submarine zones from the Soviet Union, the infrastructure of Russian expansion, and its inherent monstrosity, as they say, and these senses of foreboding and dispossession that they create. Great. Illusion is often part of luxury as well, though, if we think of worlds of luxury. So in the middle of the Alula Desert, which is one of the most wasteland spaces on the face of the earth historically, now it has become the site of the most popular 5-star luxury spa in the world, done by architect Jean Nouvel, the French architect. In the middle of the desert, you can go there and have mirages while getting massages and things like that. Many of you know Rafik Anadol. He uses algorithms and all that. All I'm interested in here, I'm interested in the proportionality. I'm interested in the way that illusions can be archived and what it means to archive illusions, since we're doing that to a certain extent. And we have to be careful how we do that because it can be done wrong in some ways. Again, we have fantasy, figments, ghosts and shadows. This was an interesting move by a figure named Benjamin Lacombe. He's a cartoonist. You'd say, okay, what's the big deal? Well, he's taken Japanese folklore, ghost folklore, shadow, ghost, monster folklore, and he's turned them into children's cartoons in Europe, except that the Japanese would absolutely forbid that these stories would ever be taught to children. So I find that interesting. Bill Viola had his famous exhibit in 1992 of the sleepers. You walk into a room full of buckets, and all of a sudden you look in and there's 24 hours of footage of people sleeping. You can watch them as they sleep. Paolo Soleri, famous architect, had his underground city that he designed and his philosophy along with it called arcology. A friend of mine, Michael Marder, has gone and taken artifacts from herbs in Chernobyl, leaves, grass, and used a with a figure named Anas Tandoor, she's a great visual artist. He's used a strange method that's able to extract the radiation and showcase the radiation embedded in the vegetal worlds of Chernobyl. Serkan Özkaya, famous Turkish visual artist. You guys know about the rumors of the back rooms, right? The back rooms were this online urban legend where suddenly you could get trapped in these kind of liminal spaces, these nowheres of back rooms. Belkis Ayan, great Cuban printmaker, used a secret society called the Abakua, used their folklore to create these shadow visions. Alison Janae Hamilton goes into the bayou folklore of the American South to look at figures called the haints, or hybrid creatures who are stuck in the swamps and who trick you in various ways. Alfred Cuban, one of my absolute favorites, illustrated for Kafka and others. He has figures called the White Bride, the Black Bride. You see these kind of strange swamps and areas like that. And women tarot card decks, all sorts of things, right? Now, what I want to do next, just quickly, is to show to you something that is problematic but necessary. So this is perhaps one of the most recent, you're seeing this new text called Adrenaline, correct? This is Qayat al-Madhoun. Qayat al-Madhoun is a Palestinian writer who was born in a refugee camp in Syria, but he's of Palestinian origin. And he writes a book called Adrenaline, and he uses classical calligraphy on the front. But I want to, because this is at the center of our popular imagination right now, the atrocities that are happening in his homeland, I want you to see how Palestinian writers are writing about this situation, not how the Western media or Western activists or on any side of the divide, on any side of the political spectrum, they all treat it with the heavy, onerous burden of the reality principle. And I want us to see this, what would perhaps seem to you as profane, that a Palestinian writer, and one who is deeply respected by his own people, by the way, who writes in Arabic, first and foremost, okay? How they write. So this is a short passage by him called How I Became. Her grief fell from the balcony and broke into pieces, so she needed a new grief. When I went with her to the market, the prices were unreal, so I advised her to buy a used grief. We found one in excellent condition, although it was a bit big. As the vendor told us, it belonged to a young poet who had killed himself the previous summer. She liked this grief, so we decided to take it. We argued with the vendor over the price, and he said he'd give us an angst dating from the 60s as a free gift if we bought the grief. We agreed, and I was happy with this unexpected angst. She sensed this and said, "It's yours." I took it and put it in my bag, and we went off. In the evening, I remembered it and took it out of the bag and examined it closely. It was high quality and in excellent condition despite half a century of use. The vendor must have been unaware of its value, otherwise he wouldn't have given it to us in exchange for buying a young poet's low-quality grief. The thing that pleased me most about it was that it was existential angst, meticulously crafted and containing details of extraordinary subtlety and beauty. It must have belonged to an intellectual with encyclopedic knowledge of a former prisoner. I began to use it, and insomnia became my constant companion. I became an enthusiastic supporter of peace negotiations and stopped visiting relatives. There were increasing numbers of memoirs in my bookshelves, and I no longer voiced my opinion, except on rare occasions. Human beings became more precious to me than nations, and I began to feel a general ennui. But what I noticed most was that I had become a poet. Now, this is not social realism. This is not a catalog of blood and of casualties and of our numerical obsession with the mounting slaughter. This is a weird tale about somebody who vicariously, almost like a blood transfusion, injects themselves with the moods or inhales themselves, inhales the moods and the affects of other people, who treats experiences as if they're items in a bazaar or marketplace that can be purchased and acquired. Now, my question to all of you is, what is the implication of thinking that this is actually possible? That you can purchase the grief of a young poet who killed himself the previous summer. This is very strategic on his part. Who has a thought? Ishida, if you see a hand go up. What's the outer consequence? If this is our paradigm, if we actually, because that's what I'm asking all of you to do. I'm sending you to marketplaces to acquire the best illusions. And they don't belong to you. In fact, I absolutely forbid anyone from having this, myself included, this indulgent subjective moment of, I brought my own dream. Please don't bring your own dream. I want you to borrow or steal someone else's. Right? I'm giving you the entire continuum of history and the entire space of the world to select from. But it has to be secondhand. I want you to find it, right? Not to create it. So what's the implication of thinking that we can actually navigate and do this, that we can possess other states? Go ahead, do you want to call on?
Yeah, Herbert.
That's actually sad.
Hey, pseudonym. No, but Jason, I think to dream in this way, to dream a stolen dream, is to be not dreamt for.
That's good. So Said, let me ask you this. How would you feel if you started, think about this awkward moment of encounter where if you and I were talking about a loss that happened in your life, someone in your family has passed, and you're upset. What happens if I start outcrying you at the table? If I show more sorrow towards the loss of your intimate family member than you do? That's perverse, no? On some level. It's awkward. Because then your instinct would be to comfort me and tell me it's all right, I'll get through this. But it's a weird moment of transmission that takes place. But that's actually what I'm asking you to do. I want you to steal from the soul of others. And I want you to not just inhabit it, but intensify their illusions for 8 weeks to the extent that they become your own. And that is, by the way, the greatest violation at some level, but it's also the greatest honor. Go read how Deleuze describes his relationship to the history of philosophers. Right? He abducts them. He seizes them. He takes them by surprise. He forces them into new territories, into new relationalities. No mercy. And Deleuze is we all think of him as a very nice sort of figure in certain ways. But it is the most violent. Read when he says that. His relationship to them, because he thinks, sometimes he says, it's like shooting an arrow. You find an arrow in a field, you shoot it elsewhere. That's what he does with philosophers. That deterritorialization principle means I go into their house, I take their most prized artifacts, and I rob them and take them elsewhere. This is what pirates do. This is what smugglers do. This is what thieves do. We have to become that because we have thousands of years from ancient Egypt all the way to, again, the metaverse that is impending. We have thousands of years of creative samples that have amounted to nothing. Cannot stop a kid from this author's homeland from being bombed tonight. You should be ashamed of yourselves. I should be ashamed of ourselves. That has to stop. So I'm not having delusions of grandeur here, but I'm saying actually the way towards an incremental form of resistance is delusions of grandeur. We have to believe that our thoughts actually have power, greater power than this. That they're not just some trivial thing that we call a seminar. That they have impact, that they have effective abilities. But for that, we have to get out of, what does Nietzsche warn us? He says the most tragic destiny that can befall a thinker is what he calls the ascetic ideal. The ascetic ideal is when we go up on the mountain and we think we've transcended the world and we're just in the domain of philosophy or of creativity or of artistry. right? No, he says, this is a very amazing aphorism he has. He says, remember, there is only one world. And what Nietzsche doesn't finish that line of saying is, there is one world and they own it. Right? If you think, well, I don't want to play the game, that just means you lose the game. You're playing it. And you're losing it. We're all losing it. So in order for us to, again, infuse this, we go to a Palestinian author like him, and instead of him telling us that our duty ethically is to bear witness, to offer testimony, and I'm not against you doing that on your social media channels. Do that stuff if you want to do it. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a different domain. But there's another game, and even a more powerful one at work, where you're not just foot soldiers, you have to become co-conspirators in the most damaged zones on earth. He is telling you, go to the marketplace, find the sorrow, the anguish, the agony of some random stranger and spin the hell out of it in some way. And that is a very weird prescription for you, someone you would think would want you to preserve the truth of his nearly extinct peoples. Right? But you have to trust them, and you have to forego our own ethical instincts. We can't superimpose them. I will let a Palestinian poet tell me how to think about the Palestinian disappearance. Does that make sense? I will honor them to be my guide there. And if he tells me there's something key in this weird narrative about going and purchasing griefs of strangers, then that vicariousness, that principle of vicariousness must be essential. Because, and it is, because here's what we don't do. Every time we post something about the Palestinian onslaught that is ongoing, we also reify and confirm that it's not us. Because we have the luxury of the transmission and publicity of the message. That platform already differentiates and distinguishes us in the very way that Marx very brilliantly, by the way, understood that to give charity is not to align yourself with the poor, but to differentiate yourself from the poor. It creates a clear, that seeming interface is actually a division, a hierarchy, that then allows you the delusion of self-righteousness and of a sort of moral gesture of a gift, but really tells you subconsciously, I'm better than him. I'm better than that guy in the street because I can give them $5 and they can't give me $5. It's a one-way thing. Well, it's the same with the images that we're sharing and the news bulletins that we're sharing. And again, I'm not opposed to that. I'm just saying that's not what Beth Al-Matun is asking us to do. He's telling us, I want something deeper. I want vicariousness. I want a shudder or tremor of maybe on some really fugitive night. God help you if you ever think, or I ever think, we know what it means to be a Palestinian under siege. That's not saying that. But maybe some night there can be a stabbing pain in the back that gives you even the slightest visceral sense of what it might be like to be there. Right? I don't say this with any street credibility whatsoever. I've never been a political prisoner, but I've got 3 in my family. Staring at their wounds is not the same as having those wounds, but it gets us close. It gets us some haunting proximity to the event. And I've been in 4 cities that were being bombed. That doesn't mean I live in cities that are chronically being bombed. I had the awful luxury of a couple of nights of air raid sirens, not decades like Iraqis do, right? So this is important, the vicariousness that he shows there. Andrew, what else did you want to say, please?
So to go on the other side of this coin, I'll bring attention briefly to the fact that the poet's angst that made this Palestinian into a poet is half a century old, which implies that there are older emotions still. Now, the implication on the flip side of all of what we've talked about, vicariousness, is the implication that if you could go to a bazaar and buy this angst, buy this misery, buy this guilt, buy whatever the hell you want, what the fuck makes you think that what you think was yours was ever yours at all?
Well, it also means you're right, you're in a trader's market where now everything that is considered subjective or interior to your world is also up for grabs and up for sale. So it requires immense vulnerability. And he doesn't mention what the price is. The price might be the forfeiture of a memory of your own, or a travesty of your own. In fact, that would have been a cool element for him to describe. I would assume that's actually what it is the case, that we're not just talking about paying currency, abstract dollars or something like that, but that there's actually a deeper transaction going on there. And that's a very intriguing one. I would say this, notice that there are two different types of markets with respect to temporality or time. Capitalist markets tend to devalue things that are older, right? But markets that are tied to crafts that are typically medieval or ancient, like winemaking, right? Their value goes up with time. So it's an interesting thing whether or not moods or affects or agonies or miseries age like wine in this landscape, literary landscape that he's created. That may be the case. That may be the case, that an ancient sadness is more valuable, is the most precious, if we could locate it. But then there's also the other thing of how many hands it's traveled through, how many owners and possessors that it's had, and what are the implications when it's been altered. Things that are used, when you go buy used books, you always look at the condition of them, right? Because you want the value, you want the rare manuscript, but you also don't want pages torn, right? So this becomes an interesting question of how these objects are tampered with. And that, by the way, when you are dealing with spaces of violence globally, all you get are second-hand narratives that clearly have misinterpretations, because in a war zone, no one has a clear perception of what happened. So you know that. You should know that from the outset. You should not have this like journalistic, arrogant delusion that you can tell things as they actually, the people who actually undergo them don't quite know what happened. So very interesting. Marie, did you want to say something?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
From the excerpt and also Nietzsche's example of aesthetic ideal, I just stayed thinking about how there is a difficulty of assimilation of that kind of experience. So reading the excerpt, it seemed to me that not only the poet's grief was bought, but it wasn't entirely his grief as well. Like it's hard, but a sort of fractal vision into the past. Like the poet only became possessed by this kind of angst and produced and wrote and became effectively a poet through also the buying of another people's grief. He couldn't. There isn't this place, as in Nietzsche's example, where you can see reality from the top and estrange yourself from it. So we can't find exactly, we can't locate the basis and more real experience that could unlock it all. There's this difficulty of assimilation, and I think that's part of its effectiveness, that you become a poet because ideas aren't solved yet, that they cease, they return, they have a circular motion in your mind that is entirely different from a finished telling of your experience.
And I love that because it opens us to a very dangerous thought experiment. So I would ask all of you to consider, based on what Marin's saying, imagine that your relationship to the artifacts that you're going to assemble, you have 7 weeks to find 15 different examples, that those 15 should have the effect on you, or the relation to you, of the dissociative split that you would experience if you were told about your past lives. All right, and Marin, this is based on something you just said. I'm going to get to that. So when you are in the hands of a fortune teller, if you allow yourself to immerse yourself in the narrative matrix of their belief system, meaning go with them, suspend your disbelief that you don't believe in past lives. And she shows you images, she shows you pictures, she shows you dates and times, she tells you stories about past lives. If you actually take responsibility for them, this becomes interesting. Now you find a writer from this 14th century, and she says, you were that writer. How is that writer different than the way you guys read Kant, God help you, the way you guys read Kant and then go take a seminar on Kantian logic? You know, the way that you distance yourself from that outer kind of analytic object, you can't do that if you found out that Kant was you in a past life. I don't wish that on any of you, but if you were to find that out, right? Now it resonates differently. There's a weird sense of correlation, of intimacy, but it's a bizarre intimacy, because what do you do with it? It's an obsolete intimacy at some level. It's an expired promise, right? So the archaicism of it, but nevertheless, you feel some slightly greater connection. Look, I'll tell you this. I have done this with my favorite writers in the history of my life. I have created bizarre blood allegiances in my head with them that have nothing to do with factual reality, right? You have to believe you're the inheritor, you're the chosen, you're the disciple, you're the legacy. Go read Nietzsche's effect on any number of 20th century. It's not just, we like Nietzsche, he's a cool philosopher. Go read what Deleuze thinks Nietzsche is to him, what Bataille thinks Nietzsche is to him, right? It's inspiration in the most violent Greek etymological sense of the word, inspiros, to breathe into. When Bataille says, when I asked you earlier if you and I were sitting, if Clara and I were sitting at a table, and she tells me about the death of her cousin, and I start sobbing uncontrollably in this weird moment, Bataille says, quote, I picture Nietzsche taking his long walks by that lake, Silvaplana Lake. I picture him leaning against the pyramidal rock that he used to lean against and think. I picture Nietzsche laughing, and whenever I picture Nietzsche laughing, I begin to cry. But I did the formula, the recipe, exactly the way that I've just prescribed it to you. Bataille is a French person from the early 1900s. Nietzsche is dead by the time Bataille is on the scene. They have zero material connection to one another. Nietzsche didn't choose Bataille, he didn't teach Bataille, he didn't train Bataille. Try telling Bataille that. He feels Nietzsche sent him personal messages. He feels every line of Zarathustra was composed to him. That's the omnipotence of thought delusion taken at the highest levels in philosophy. Right? This guy willed me into being because I have a job to do. I have unfinished business with the world. I'm the executioner of that game or that will. That's a different mindset. And I have that towards a handful of writers. And then I don't have that at all towards other writers who I love and admire. I don't have any delusional imagination that Henri Michaud, who I admire immensely, and I have any connection other than that I admire his work, or Beckett, or even Kafka. But Ahmed Shamlou, the Iranian poet, you would think that he's my uncle in my mind. But I never met Shamlou. I had a chance to in the year 2000, was supposed to. Didn't happen. He died that year before I was going to meet him. Oh, it's a lost opportunity, circumstance. But actually that allows you to generate an entire hypothetical universe of the things that would have been spoken, that would have been offered to one another. And that is as good as real to me, because you earn it. You then write it into existence, right? You do the work. So this becomes an interesting question, that these 15 things which you're going to bring will have the imprint not of a random constellation of cool things you found, but you have to believe conspiratorially, like a great schizophrenic would, that they are absolutely essential to your existence going forward, even in ways that are not yet deciphered, that they will play a role at some point, like some time release capsule, that these things you assemble, these 15 all have a part to play in the drama. Does this make sense? And to create that elevated classification, that's not just kind of rational knowledge. Oh, I read Heidegger, oh, I read this. By the way, here's an interesting thing. When I said Bataille bleeds on every page for Nietzsche, if you read Heidegger's 4 volumes on Nietzsche, which are called On Nietzsche, volumes 1 through 4, each one of them is about 700 pages long. They're ridiculous. I've read 3 of the 4. I could not get through the 4th. And if you say, well, what's the language like? Heidegger famously had a line. He said, Nietzsche is a game that cannot be called off. Right? It's a very important line. So he felt he had to play the game. And you read it, and it's actually kind of boring. Like 800 pages of very close, precise analysis, but turning Nietzsche into a philosopher, less poetic, less stylistic and all that. And you say, my God, he totally misunderstood. He didn't take it that experiential route, the way that Bataille did, the way that others did. He didn't let it kind of get in the veins. You're wrong. You don't write 800-page volumes unless it's gnawing at you, unless it's biting at you. Right? Unless it's a relentless pulsation in the mind. Heidegger is not allowed to write Being and Time, whether you like it or not, his masterpiece, until he's done purging this possession of Nietzsche. That's an interesting thing. It means that he chose him as the one philosopher who was not just, I read Socrates, or I read Kierkegaard, or I read Schopenhauer. He's not just one of the others. He's the one that is going to test you in certain ways and be essential to your destiny. That's a mindset. It's the same as Don Quixote choosing to become a knight at some level. That's the omnipotence of thought delusion. Now, just quickly, another quick key. Let's go back to Ghayat al-Matun and look at this next poem. Are you able to see this here? Called
Yes.
4,978 and 1 Nights. To Faraj Bayrakdar, who spent 14 years in prison. 4,978 is the number of nights this person spent in jail. Okay? 4,979 isn't the number of a secret bank account or the solution to a cubic equation. I assure you it's not a random number devoid of reason or a number that came up by chance in a lottery draw. It's a sticky number that isn't like the numbers of mobile phones or car license plates. 4,979 means the systematic escalation of pain, the essence of the wolf. It means 119,496 hours, and it means 7,169,760 minutes, and it also means 430,185,600 seconds. Gaining 4,979 days means you lose out on 13 forbidden women and 37 casual relationships and 2 children who were never born. Gaining these 4,979 days means you lose 465,328 steps in the alleyways of old Damascus and 114 funerals that happened without you, and 13,712 bottles of beer, 3 of them flat. It means you don't miss the bus 271 times and don't win the price of the lottery ticket 11 times. Means you missed the World Cup 3.5 times and New Year's Eve 14 times and the collapse of the Soviet Union once. Imagine, only once. 4,979 means 4,978 and 1 nights without Scheherazade, 4,978 and 1 nights with Shahryar only. Shahryar is the mad king who kills and beheads people. Shahryar, whose death you also missed. Okay. What does this numerology make us do? When we define the cumulative number of days spent in a lost zone of a prison, of a dungeon, in terms of all of the hypothetical universes that could have occurred and which passed unexperienced. What is the consequence for us sitting here that some poor bastard spent 14 years in a prison and missed 100 and something funerals? And two children who were never born. Does that person have a right to avenge themselves against the world on behalf of the loss of potential universes? This has to be part of our ethics as well, or part of our code going forward. Because what we're talking about is someone who will set their eyes and their sights on reality in the name of illusions. Illusions are not just fantastical apparitions, they're also worlds that don't come to pass. They're the missing places, the missing forms. When you kill a poet when they're 23 years old, you kill all the books they would have written, good or bad. What does it mean for us to go in search of the books they didn't write? How do you honor that? By writing them? That would be arrogant of us. And when I say avenging them, how do you avenge that? Who do you blame? Now, this leads us to a problem. This leads us to a Nietzschean problem. Who does Nietzsche blame? Everyone. And no one. If you read closely in Beyond Good and Evil, he says, I do not fight individuals, I only fight victorious causes. But I have a problem with that, because will you ever be able to fight capitalism? No. All you'll ever meet are its minions, its servants. Will you fight any ism, any totalitarianism? No, it's too abstract. What does it mean to fight a victorious cause if all you see are the individuals who uphold victorious causes? So what do? Do you attack those who are the servants of victorious causes? This is something that we have not done, by the way, as a group. And it probably happened to you. If you're here, you probably had some moments of alienation in your youth where you were a bit freakish or misfit in your own family context, because most people don't think in these ways or want to think in these ways. And you had that awkward moment where you tried to explain something or share something with a parent, with a cousin, with a whatever, and realized that there was an incommunicability there. So you did one of two things. You either gave up, surrendered the space, and said, whatever, you don't get it, and receded into your solitude and lionized your alienation, or you fought in a kind of cheap adolescent rebellion. You tried to impose the idea. You tried to tell them why it's better. Both are failed exercises because you're outnumbered. This is guerrilla warfare. You will lose every time in a face-to-face confrontation with reality. They have thousands of years, they have millennia of structures, victorious structures. We are saboteurs. That's different then, right? Sabotage is a far more insidious process. So I want to go back to that. I'm telling you, and I do this for particular reasons, so you don't think I'm just sending you out to be fanatics, sort of on a kind of terrorist mission. No, although by the way, Baudrillard does use that term. He calls in Radical Thought in The Perfect Crime, he says, we must terrorize reality. So here's an interesting question. I'm telling you that there's somebody who you've never heard of before, whose name most of you couldn't even pronounce, that this Palestinian writer just summoned. He told you that he lost 14 years of his life. You guys got to do something about it. Because that shouldn't happen. And it happened on your watch. I'm holding you accountable. I'm holding myself accountable. It happened on our watch. It happened in our era, in our time. It's very easy to blame whatever ism and whatever military political apparatus. But it's on us that we didn't think of a more crafty way to elude that. Instead, we sat around reading Hegel in a seminar on Saturdays. Right? No, that's got to stop at some point. Unless you have a cool way of turning Hegel into a trick that can stop that from happening. If you got that, I'm all ears. But if you want to do this low-stakes discussion of tinkering with little concepts from the late 1700s and thinking it's a great accomplishment, I'm done with that. At least I'm not your audience. No patience sitting around for these little necrophilic exercises in abstract thought. And I'm not saying this in a cruel way. I'm just saying this is what illusion means to me. To turn these figures, all of you have taken multiple seminars at this place. They got to be worth something, for Christ's sakes. It can't just be a diversion or an entertainment on the weekend or something that makes you feel smarter than everybody else. God help you. You're not. I'm not. They won. You're idiots. You're geniuses and you're idiots. Congratulations. You follow? I feel that way too. Right? So, there's never been one goddamn revolution in history that belonged to our side. You notice that? It's always these cheap throwaway ideologies that win the day. From one end of the political spectrum to the other. There's never been a poetic revolution that I've ever seen. There's never been a philosophical revolution. God help him, poor Plato, that bastard back in Athens, dreams of an age of philosopher kings. Name me once where that's ever happened. And I don't even know if that should happen. In fact, I don't want even that to happen. I've never wanted to be a king, but I sure as hell don't want them to be kings either. These undeserving types, right? These sadists. So we have to, with a little bit of shame, but also a little bit of pride and contempt for ourselves and for them, we have to go forward and figure out how to turn illusions into disruptive and explosive instruments. So the way that I want to do that with the remaining time that we have today, and then again, the game falls on your shoulders to impress yourselves, surprise yourselves. You have 7 days to just go and wherever, to whatever outer reaches, come up with the slickest things that you can find in each category. But for now, let's start by doing this. There's a book. There are many books, but there's a book by interesting figure, You wouldn't think that someone would bother to do this in the world. I'm going to share it with you in a second. Called A Dictionary of Hallucinations. You can see it here. This person he's an academic, but wrote a book that has zero academic value whatsoever. Probably did not help them get tenure or promotions or raises in their salary at all, because it literally is a glossary and catalog of hallucinations, starting with absinthe hallucinations to Alice in Wonderland syndrome. You can find that. And you see things, strange things. Also known as Alice in Wonderland effect or Wonderland syndrome. Subjective feelings such as derealization, depersonalization, somatopsychic duality, and perceptual symptoms such as illusory changes in the size, distance, or position of stationary objects. Now that's interesting. Remember that Alice gets bigger and smaller before she enters Wonderland. She has a proportion problem, a scale problem, a perceptual disruption in her sense of size and distance of things, but also to the position of stationary objects. If you remember, keys and bottles are constantly receding from her grasp, right? So this is an example. So what I want to do is I want Ishida to go and ask everyone here, if we can go one after another, to choose a number between 1 and 553. And we're just going to jump from hallucination to hallucination and see what you come up with. Do you want to ask someone to start? 1 to 553.
Do you want to just, type numbers in the chat and then we can call out?
But then I want that person to also tell me when I'll read the entry just for everybody, but I want them to tell me what the detail is that they find the most intriguing about the summary. Something they could use. So do we have a number yet?
Yeah, we have
Person-
77.
Who's the person who?
Leandra,
Leandra said what number?
77.
77. Okay. Almost. Give me a second, everyone. It's 77. Okay. Which one do you want? You can have this very strange one, the Brobdingnagian hallucination or broken spectre. Leandra, you choose.
Yeah, this very strange name, Brobdingnagian hallucination.
All right.
Please.
Also known in the literature in the misspelled variants, Brobdingnagian hallucination and Brobdingnagian hallucination. The term is indebted to Brobdingnag, the name of a fictitious country inhabited by huge people, featuring in the novel Gulliver's Travels by the Irish poet and author Jonathan Swift. It is used as a synonym for the term Gulliverian hallucination, i.e., a visual hallucination in which disproportionately large human figures are perceived, either in isolation or against a background of regular proportions. What do you find interesting about that? As a technique or tactic that we must use. Imagine you're in a room with an ordinary person and your job is to spellbind them, mesmerize them, hypnotize them. According to this, what is the effect that you must be able to impose on them? You should be able to make them feel that you are Leonard, do you have it?
Yeah, this is very interesting because I usually had some kind of this, especially when I was in this state between dream and you wake up when I was sleeping, when you were sleeping, dreaming, and you start to wake up, but you are not really woke. I had this kind of of hallucination before. It's very interesting.
Good.
And
Well, then what's at the heart of it that we can extract from here? A kind of an effect. What's the effect then of a Gulliverian hallucination? Is that we see something as
disproportionately large, of
Right.
a human figure as disproportionately, and it's all and it's funny that it's based on Gulliver's Travels.
Mhm.
It's very famous, but I have never read it.
Well, there's some interesting things to that, by the way. Interestingly, even the cult in Japan, which is a cult that committed a terrorist act in the 90s, their compound, their headquarters was in an abandoned amusement park of Gulliver's Travels. And they used to have their secret society meetings in the 1990s in the body of Gulliver, this huge giant that was sprawled out on the ground. But what I would find interesting is that it was well known among Sufi mystics, Persian Sufi mystics, that they had the ability to make people think that they were swelling in size. Right? So the great figure Hallaj, who was executed, he was crucified and burned alive. They say that he could expand his shadow, but also his presence would loom to the point that he would take up the entire room. Now, this is something, if I had my friend Dejan Lukic here, he would talk about charisma. And he would say that charismatic power, this is one of the symptoms of charismatic power. Now, that's very easy to do. I'm going to tell you this perceptually when you have an authoritarian ideological reality principle behind you. So all of you thought that your first grade teachers were huge, giants, because you were a child by proportion, but also because of the aura of authority that they commanded. That's easy to do. It's very easy for a dictator. For instance, Mr. Putin is actually extremely short, right?
And now I'm thinking about the voice, how the discourse, the voice can do this very well.
Excellent,
Yeah,
excellent.
our voice can occupy all the place and
Excellent.
and be a power. And
Absolutely.
of course, we can think in Hitler and you know all this kind of dictators.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. A lot of, this leading men, sort of macho figures in Hollywood are actually very short by average. Tom Cruise is very short, for instance. So it's easy to do this when all of culture and society is behind you. But what if you're Charles Manson? Charles Manson, the cult leader. He's a nobody. At economic, social, political, cultural levels, he's a bum. He's a loser. He has zero authority given to him by the reality principle. And he's like 5'3" or 5'4". And yet when people spoke of him, he was gigantic. He was enormous in their minds. That's a perceptual trick that we should learn how to do. Objects in the mirror may appear larger than they are. We have to be able to do that because if it's part of guerrilla resistance, if we are outnumbered and we are outweaponed, we have to make sure our weapons are magnified. I'll tell you this, and this is not, I don't want to make a connection to this because I don't admire these movements in the least, but so-called terrorist movements like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, one of their only strategic accomplishments is that they're able to create specters of size and scale and ability that they don't actually have. Al-Qaeda didn't actually have many resources behind its one attack, but it made the whole world think that it was a boogeyman that was lurking around every corner with sleeper cells all across the world. Right? There is something that we can even learn from that ability, right? To make ourselves seem stronger than we appear. By the way, and it's not about propaganda. Do you guys know what Bolshevik means? Lenin was smart. Lenin had a ragtag group of like 5 guys in Moscow. And when he went to participate in the parliamentary elections, he named his party the Bolshevik Party, means dominant. And a lot of idiots fell for it. And they're like, wow, that must be the major party because they're called the dominant party. Sometimes hype is all you need, but we're going to be even more slick in our techniques here of how we make ourselves seem greater than we are even, or grander than we are. Good. Who's got another? Ishida, tell me another person and another place to go.
We have Andrew with 444.
444. Okay. see. Almost there, Andrew. Andrew, you want to read half of this? You chose rainbow. You want to
Yes,
read
sir.
it for us?
All right, give me 1
Or
second.
actually, I'm sorry, I'm on the. Oh no, there is no 4-4. That's amazing. Look at that. You picked a gap. There's 4-4-3, and there's 4-4-5. So you can go one. Let's make it a game. You can go one step back or one forward. You can choose quasi hallucination, quick motion phenomenon, or rainbow.
All right, heads 4-4-3, tails 4-4-5. Heads, we're going with 4-4-3.
All right, which one?
Let's read off half of quick motion phenomenon. Why not?
All right, go for it.
All right. Also known as time grabbing phenomenon. The term quick motion phenomenon is a loose translation of the German expression Zeitraffverphänomen, literally time shortening phenomenon or time abridgment phenomenon. The term was introduced in or shortly before 1934 by Austrian neurologist Otto Potzwil and Hans Hoff. It is used to denote a rare variant of tachypsychia, which is itself classified as a type of time distortion, in which psychological time is significantly sped up. As a result, time seems to pass too quickly, and people and objects are perceived as if rushing about at an extraordinary speed. The quick motion phenomenon has been described chiefly with reference to the visual modality, but it can also affect the auditory modality. In the latter case, people may seem to be talking too fast and too loud in high-pitched voices, like an audio tape played at fast forward. The accompanying sensation that one's own movements are slowing down is called a slow motion hallucination. The quick motion phenomenon was described as early as 1917 in an 8-year-old boy with fever by a German psychiatrist called Klein. Historically, the phenomenon has been associated primarily with temporal lobe dysfunction. However, emerging empirical evidence would seem to indicate that the neurobiological correlates of time perception are located within an extensive network that includes the right parietal lobe, the basal ganglia, and the cerebellum.
All right, cool. Tell us what's intriguing about the quick motion phenomenon then. What's the power that we should try paranormally to be able to project?
So this is actually something, if you've paid attention to whenever you listen to music that you've encountered. One of the things that was mentioned, and in fact, interestingly noted by the poet Amiri Baraka, is that when you get into a groove of a certain song, your heartbeat starts synchronizing to the beat of the song. If you've noticed, sometimes if you've been in a certain emotional state or something like that, and you play a song with a certain BPM, beats per minute, you'll notice, and sometimes you'll hear the song almost slower than it has been, and then some days you'll hear it as if it were faster than you expected it to be. If we are to employ these illusory weapons against someone, one of the things that must be important is to know the pulse of our enemy. Because one of the things that is important, as can be seen in any sort of guerrilla warfare and the implementation of camouflage, et cetera, is that the perception of the enemy is the most important thing to control and to obfuscate if necessary. So if we can, say, speed up the tape, as the description implied, to appear faster, to appear blindingly fast, faster than they expect, then of course one can sweep in, carry out an attack, and then vanish before they even know what the hell happened. Alternatively, to slow it down, one can make something that would be something that would happen in a second appear to take decades of their life, for instance.
Brilliant. This would be an amazing thing for us to explore further, right? Can you actually create that perceptual sense that you were talking about? There are books, Andrew and everyone, that can, I've found them, they're very few, I would count only 3 of them, that can make people hyperventilate, right? And it's because of the use of punctuation, or rather the erasure of punctuation. That's one of the keys to it. That doesn't allow you to breathe and stop, and so it just streams forward. So I've seen people kind of start to inhale, exhale in a kind of rapid state because of reading something, just in the same way you said that a beat per minute sort of in a song can adjust the heart rate. Interestingly, there was a psychoanalyst who I've mentioned this before, I think in another seminar, who put schizophrenics on a roller coaster. And when they were asked to deduce how long the drop was, the main drop of the roller coaster, whereas so-called normal or sane people would say 2 to 3 seconds, they would typically say 10 to 15 seconds. Right? That's what they would report, which means it took longer for them. And the idea that you would typically think is that, oh, so then things move slower for schizophrenics. It's actually quite the opposite. It's precisely what you said, when it's that the world is constantly in such a state of acceleration that they experience it almost like the moment of when you get in a car accident, that things start to quickly seem like they've slowed down and you see your entire life passing through your eyes. Tachypsychia, though, and this is something instrumental for you to think about, Andrew, when people have tachypsychic moments, time distortions where things speed up, the typical emotional response is terror, is fear, extreme fear, right? So that's an interesting thing to make wonder about, because there is another version of that. If you look at sibyls and oracles who would have a momentary experience of God, right? That always didn't last long enough, that always faded too quickly. It also is a key to ecstasy in some certain ways, the speeding up of realities. And so this is something that, by the way, even great cult leaders and sort of the leader of the assassins, Hassan Sabo, was famous for. He would never spend prolonged periods of time in discourse with any individual member of his cult. He would spend very limited amounts of time to keep people craving and desiring and feeling like it wasn't long enough. So it's interesting. But yeah, the idea that we could make ourselves seem that we're moving faster than everyone else. By the way, even hustlers know, you mentioned this to a certain extent, even hustlers know that it gives you a critical advantage when you're trying to steal something from someone or take advantage of someone or exploit someone, that if you can manipulate the rate and the pace of the conversation. So in the street, listen, we got to do this quick. Stop looking around. Stop looking around. We got to get this done fast. Right? There are people watching. Everywhere. Just give me the money. Give me the money quickly. They use speed. They use the velocity of the language to not allow you to doubt, to question, to resist, to offer an alternative. That's one of the hustlers' repertoires, is their use of speed. And as a last point, among contemporary thinkers, there's perhaps no one who's more interested in figuring out ways of slicing into major totalitarian systems than Paul Virilio. And Virilio, if one of the essences of his dromology, sort of his travel kind of methodology of resistance, is to understand speed. Speed is an absolutely crucial concept in his matrix, his world matrix. So excellent, very cool. Zach, did you want to say something, or did you have you want to go to a page?
Yeah, I wanted to say something briefly.
Yeah, right ahead.
Kind of as we've sort of started talking about tactics, and Jason, you kind of posed the question of, well, essentially, like what effect could we produce, etc. I do want to also just kind of propose that, I really liked that framing that you used also of the sort of the seducer, the one-on-one interaction as opposed to the mass communication interaction. Hopefully, there's room in this kind of conversation for thinking of liberatory effects.
Absolutely.
Rather than simply kind of offensive effects, right? When I imagine what a seducer would do, or when I imagine what I could do, essentially to, as you say, kind of like fight against reality, right? My mind hopefully can go to moments of, I don't know if you want to use sort of grandiose language of, tearing down the veil or whatever it is, or of kind of problematizing, as opposed to of Well, I guess of kind of
Yeah.
remedy rather than, imagining that I might be sort of having to
That could, I don't
find
want to
some.
interrupt you, but
No, yeah.
you're asking for me. No, you're asking for me the most difficult and crucial question that we have to answer, and I didn't fulfill it sort of entirely, which is, what's our end game? To destroy people, to ruin their lives, or is it to elevate, exhilarate, intensify them? Those who know me know that I don't like to use the term vitalism very much, but if you know any of my lineage, I want people to be more powerful than they are, not in the Foucault sense of power of becoming aristocrats and becoming, prison guards, but rather becoming more elegant, more intriguing, more complex than they are ever before, having moments of profound, entrancing insight. But what if the only way to do that is what Artaud realized, which is a theater of cruelty? What if, when a vampire offers people their bite, which would intensify their existence, grant them powers, spiritual, mental faculties that they never had before, the ability to read minds, the ability to enter others' dreams, the ability to see things move animistically beneath the surface? And people say, no, they don't want that. They love their mediocrity. They love their chains. They love their enslavement. And the problem with that is that would be okay. There's a series of I don't like the terms ethical or moral, but let's call them that. There's an honor code that we have to figure out here. Would this be a fair premise for us to speak about illusory tactics of incision or infiltration if people were just living on a neutral island by themselves of their own volition? No, I'd leave them alone. But they're not. They're in the midst of forces and influences which are turning them into monsters. And I must judge that. If you cannot judge the world and not judge the people in the world who are either complicit or who are engaged directly with these things, in which case, either we have to believe that our poets, our artists, our writers, our thinkers are wondrous enough that they should be unleashed as an alternative. I'm not saying antidote, because that's too curative, that's too redemptive, but an alternative to the ideologies of the everyday. They're being bombarded and affected and infected anyway. The idea like that we don't, and you're not saying this, that's why you're taking up the idea of the seducer, right? Very in an emancipatory way, in a liberating way. I'm for that as well, but not in a messianic way that we're supposed to save them from themselves, because that would place us in a very, very dangerous role. That's the slippery slope of the psychoanalyst, right? Who went into the Pandora's box of the unconscious and then developed a savior complex along the way. We may just be escape artists who can teach forms of breakout and of runaway, right? By creating a kind of Pied Piper's intimation, a melody in the outskirts that they can follow, a temptation in the desert that they can chase, a white rabbit, right? Maybe that's all we're doing here with our illusions. We're creating white rabbits that might break them from their math homework, which is what Alice's sister is doing on the surface of things. But for that, we have to make some very decisive judgments, which is we have to look at them, and by them, I mean the human, and decide, does it disgust us? There's a very the other side of our sort of enchantment is a certain nihilism. Is the very sight of the human right now something that we find displeasing enough that we should move? I mean, not move away, move on them. Make moves. Because the alternative is to let it continue. Kids have seen, on average, they say, 3.5 million commercials by age 5. Oh, they're being worked on. They're being seduced already. So why should we stay our hands with this sort of false position of neutrality? There are no individuals. There are programs out there. There is no them, I before there's a they. This is what we know from basic existentialism. They brand and imprint their ways. They condition from the split second of inception. So do we have the right? Right is a weird word. Do we have some strange obligation? You know, when you ask yourself what it is that makes a rebel willing to go to jail for 14 years, who would throw away their time, their limited time on this earth, for an abstract struggle? And if you ask Che Guevara in an interview, what is the essence of the ethos of a revolutionary, he very cutely says, el amor, love. Love of the people. No, no. It's disgust with the people. That's the only thing that would motivate it. Love of the idea of the people in some future epoch, but disgust with how the people live now and what they've been turned into. Nietzsche is, for me, the most beautiful and elegant and generous philosopher. He also, remember, spends the first half of his career condemning humanity. And that's a necessary bit of poison that then motivates the next part, which is all sorts of invitations and temptations to go beyond the human. Right? But when Bataille even says, he who does not die from being just a man will never be more than just a man. Just a man is awful then, in Bataille's estimation. There is a clear judgment being made, an executioner's tone there, saying that's horrible existence. Now that's a tough thing sometimes for some of us to unleash. And I'm not saying it comes easy, but maybe you should go and stare at more images from other parts of the world on a daily basis, and maybe you'll come to that conclusion that, yeah, it's bad. It's really bad. What they've always been, what they continue to be, what they hide from themselves about their being. And so, no, I don't think that speeding up time on them or making people seem like giants is unfair penalty. In fact, Zach, I agree with you. I think those forms of seduction and illusion, if our goal remains that we are not trying to annihilate humanity, we are trying to transform it. I will use a more magical concept rather than redeem it or improve it or evolve it in some way. I would use the more magical concept of just transformation. Anything but this, we have to shoot for. Whatever the domino effects. And magic also, unlike philosophy, unlike mathematics, unlike a lot of other genres of knowledge, leaves room and space for contingent effects, ricochets, unexpected and unforeseen outcomes. So every great magician knows that a spell can have unanticipated fallout because you're dealing with energies. And energies leak and spill. Reza Negarestani, a close brother of mine, will tell you that he unlocked a cool discovery that Freud is extremely influenced by thermodynamics, which is a scientific revolution of his own time, and that he thinks of the unconscious as an energy principle at some level, right? And well, why do you think it is that Freud thinks then that the unconscious is so messy and radioactive and leaks constantly? It's like electrical currents. It's shooting off sparks in every direction. So similarly, what we do, even if Zach or Andrew or Leandro or whomever else finds a way to create themselves as the image of a giant in someone's eyes, that will have an amazing effect in the moment on them, but it will also have unpredicted effects in reality and in the world, which we don't know. The question is, are you exhausted enough by the play that is on the stage of this theater, this global theater, that you are willing to even invite the unknown? Or do you want to see a few more acts of this saga before you make the decision that to hell with it? Let's throw dice and let's see what befalls us with these moves. So it's a personal question. I'm older than many of you, so maybe I'm more tired or more bored than some. But for me, I will tell you this to one last thing. It's a vitalist principle. I would never do anything to someone else that I wouldn't invite upon myself. That's an old alchemist thing too. The alchemists were, most of them, half blind and burned up and down all their bodies. They used to give poisons to their disciples, but they used to ingest poisons themselves to try things out, to experiment. So if Zach wants to, or Saed wants to visit me at 2 a.m. and project themselves as a giant across my bedroom wall, go for it. I'll take my medicine too and see what happens. I wouldn't unleash anything upon the world that I wouldn't try myself. All right, so where are we going next? Ishita, give us a person and a number.
Manual 225.
Okay, 225. Oh, I had it. All right, which one? Hallucinatory state, hallucinatory suggestion, hallucinatory polyopia, or hallucinatory twilight state?
Sorry. Twilight state is fine.
Twilight state. You want to read it for us?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. The
Sure.
German is gonna change this to the side. The German term hallucinatorisch, Dämmerzustand, hallucinatory twilight state, was introduced in our shorty before 1926 by the German neuropsychiatrist Karl Keist to denote a type of twilight state, a prolonged episode of clouded or narrowed consciousness during which the affected individual is virtually unaware of his or her surroundings, which is dominated by hallucinations and illusions. These hallucinations and illusions tend to display a panoramic character, thus replacing the extracorporeal environment as perceived through the senses. The hallucinatory described in the context of the hallucinatory twilight state are, could you scroll it a bit down, please?
Sure.
Yeah.
Where were
Predominant
you?
and auditory nature, but tactile and somatic hallucinations have been described as well. Klein suggested a certain, sorry, I didn't read that.
Similarity, a certain similarity, sorry.
Similarity between the hallucinations occurring in the context of the hallucinatory twilight state and those occurring in the context of delirium, including the occurrence of subsia, the perception of hallucinated animals, and and the co-occurrence and the co-occurrence of general confusion and disorientation. Conceptually as well as phenomenologically, the hallucinatory twilight state will seem to lie in a continuum with conditions such as dissociation, hysteria, fugue, hallucinatory epilepsy, postnatal confusion, alcoholic hallucination, and please scroll a little bit down as well.
The delirium. Mhm.
Yeah.
So Manuel, tell me what's intriguing here. What's the power that we should be able to do? You're in a room with someone, you're in their house, and you make them think what?
You mean like I create the hallucination in them? Or
Twilight state, what would be the effect upon them? Suddenly they feel as if they're in their bedroom, they're talking to you, and suddenly they feel
disoriented or
good, disoriented. It's a spatial hallucination. Even though it's referred to as twilight, which is a temporal thing, right? It's about the clouding or narrowing of consciousness in which you feel unaware of your surroundings. Now, this is an interesting thing. Now, what would be the implication? There are two implications here. To familiarize the defamiliar, to defamiliarize the familiar. What happens when someone no longer recognizes their house as their house?
I don't know, maybe like a sort of displacement of the self or like a fragmentation of that?
Exactly. Now, at the end, they referred to something which is called dissociative fugue state. In psychoanalysis, this is actually something that happens every year. People will find a woman on the highway. Police will find a woman on the highway just walking and wandering, and they'll take her in and they'll say, "Who are you? Where did you come from? Why are you on the highway?" And they have no clue. This is a dissociative fugue state. They say, "I don't know who I am. I don't know what I'm doing." And they say they find identification. They call up her parents and her husband. They find out that she lives 3 states away. She's an elementary school teacher in Ohio, and she's now in Las Vegas walking on the street, right? Now, here's where it becomes interesting. The parents come, the husband comes, the children come, and she doesn't recognize them. Now, there's anamnesic and there's retroactive amnesia that can happen this time, which means one of 2 things can happen when they are confronted with their real persona again. Like, no, you're a mother of 2 daughters, you're a math teacher, you're this and that. Either they can suddenly remember who they are, but they will forget everything that happened in that 2 weeks when they disappeared. That episodic burst, that rupture. Period, the fugue state. They'll have no memory of what they did for 2 weeks in Las Vegas. Or the opposite. They remember everything about the last 2 weeks and nothing of who they were before. Which means that's anterograde amnesia. That's where they have to go back then and be reacquainted. And it's always a very disturbing situation because they have to be told constantly, this is your brush, this is your wallet, this is your, and they feel zero connection to these things. They have to reacquire them through conditioning, right? So this is interesting, to make you virtually unaware of your surroundings. But there's another version of that. Kafka's good at this. The ability to transport someone to a very disturbing space. The castle, the forest, the penal colony. But by the time you realize where you are, it's too late. Meaning he hides it for pages and pages, how weird it is, how distressing it is, how transformative it is. Remember, he's the writer of Metamorphosis. He wants to change things, right? Even to things as bizarre as bugs or insects. He doesn't have problems turning humans into insects. And so he takes you to places, places where you will by necessity have to transform, but he doesn't display the effects upon you until you're deep into the territory. So how does he distract you from the space that he is constructing around you is a fascinating question that is a hallucinatory twilight state. All right, so he gets your mind, it's what illusionists do. They show you the left hand to do the trick with the right hand. What Kafka wants to hide is the Kafkaesque, which is to say the atmosphere, the zone. That's his magic. That's his great talent. He creates zones. He creates atmospheres. He creates bad worlds that should never have existed, and he brings you into them. The reason you don't resist him is because he distracts you with other decorative implements, characters, storylines, other mysteries that you think you're supposed to solve, language games, right? But really it's about the space. So that's a hallucinatory twilight state. Very cool, very cool. Thank you. Shida, what do we got next? Where are we going?
Karis, 113.
Okay. 113. And again, if we're doing this right, you should all feel some strange, intimate connection, almost as if it's a prophecy revealed. When you do fortune telling like this, in Iran, in the old world, we do this with poets. You'll pick a random, like a fortune cookie. You randomly pick a page, you put your finger down, and you convince yourself that those lines, those 2 lines, actually are telling you something immediate or imminent about your predicament. So think about that. So who again is the person?
Karis.
Karis, okay. Do you want to, which one do you want?
Complementary afterimage.
Perfect,
Right.
read it for us, please.
The term complementary afterimage refers to a type of afterimage in which the hues are approximately the complements of those in the original stimulating field. The complementary after image of a yellow circle, or for example, is executed in blue. The term complementary after image is used in opposition to the term homochromatic after image, which refers to the after image in which the distribution of hues is the same as that of the original stimulation field. Complementary after image are commonly classified as physiological illusions.
Excellent. Harsh, what do you see there that's interesting? What should the
Well,
effect?
I'm thinking about the effect that some bacteria have, that through time they try to repeat their own, if you can say, homeostasis in order to trying to predict external and the external environment situation, and trying to secure themselves from, for example, differences in pH around them. So like that something changes and then you expected it again to change, so you kind of create something to cancel it back.
Good.
That's
So now apply that. Excellent. Apply that now to an encounter. You meet someone in a cafe. How do you create a complement? What does it mean to create a complementary after image with a stranger?
Stranger. Maybe suggest that there is a familiarity with a stranger, or have met them before, or that there is something that connects you or disconnects you in order to have the opposite outcome, and in order to engage with them, like create something that polarizes this neutrality.
Excellent. Charis, if spies, if one of the essence of espionage of spies is that they should enter a room and not be noticed, and they should so be dismissed and overlooked that even when they do something and later people ask who did that or what, they can't create a facial image recognition, right? So they're able, if that is a practice, then we should be able to do the exact opposite, where you create a lingering image, a persistent, recurring image burned into the mind that 3 hours after you leave, it's still there. Like when you look at the sun and it's red when you shut your eyes, right? Now, here's something interesting. I'm going to tell you guys something based on what you said that is fascinating, that psychoanalysis totally dropped the ball on. It is a common schizophrenic symptom, a common symptom of schizophrenia, to believe that you are shooting rays from your body. Okay? It's a very common symptom, that light emanates from you, right? And then the psychoanalysts are smart enough to say, and look, if you look at prophets in history, messianic figures, they often have a halo around them, right? So look at that. That makes sense. Except what they're not actually unlocking, I've never read a psychoanalyst who was smart enough to figure out this very key detail, is that the person painting the prophet is not the prophet, is not the schizophrenic prophet who believes that lights. It means that they are inhabiting the delusion of the prophet. And this unlocks the scariest question for psychoanalysis and for human beings of all time about madness. Is madness contagious? Is madness transferable? And Freud has to reassure people, don't worry, except in rare conditions of mass hysteria, a schizophrenic cannot teach another person to be schizophrenic. Except I gave you just now a concrete aesthetic example where painters for millennia in the Renaissance, in the Gothic era, were painting halos, right? Because they fully bought into the delusion of light emanation of a schizophrenic prophet.
Okay, so the process is to seduce ourselves into the delusions of the others.
And vice versa.
Exactly. Thank you.
Very cool. Ishida, take over. Who's gonna go next?
We have two questions. I think one from Sej and then Michelle. Sej, you want to go first?
Yeah, thanks. Just on the complementary after image, this can actually be physically induced. Like you can do it even now. If you just stare at, say, something that is very red, like just stare at it fixatedly, and then close your eyes, you will see the exact opposite of that color. You'll see green. Something that's like diametrically opposite on the color wheel. And these colors are actually used to create harmonies. So where you have the most starkest contrasts, in order to so impressionists would use this to kind of like create this kind of depth in a really beautiful way just by using light. So they would never use black, right? And I mean, I guess psychologically, I was thinking about the idea of limerence. When say you meet someone who kind of, almost like, to the best of your ability starts reminding you, trying to work against it, starts reminding you of someone else you've encountered, been with, and that kind of projection that we end up doing a lot of times onto, by kind of like flattening the sort of differences that that person might have in the person that you're kind of holding on to in a certain way.
I like this a lot. Could you do something that was so flagrant or overbearing or excessive, even in a subtle way, that you create the after image, like you said, sort of that even when you're gone, you're not present, which is the equivalent of shutting the eyes, you still see the color. But you said something fascinating. You see the opposite color a lot of the time, right? Your mind will show you the opposite color. So now imagine you conspired as a team with another member of our group here, so that after you left, you sent in someone who's supposed to inhabit the exact opposite prototype of the affect that you gave. So now Michelle walks into the cafe and sits down, and she's supposed to be the exact alternative. In order to heighten your exoticism, though, do you follow? Precisely to create that contrast by which you become even more miraculous. Well, this is a great technique that actually is used by, I'll give you an example.
By cops.
But yes, good cop, bad cop for sure. But actually, I'm looking for, oh, what did I just lose here? Hold on. One second, let me go back to it. Back in the old days of early cinema, you had figures who were exaggerated sort of persona. So you see Bela Lugosi, who played vampires, often played Dracula. But more interestingly, on the right, this is a figure named Svengali, who comes from a 19th century novel about a young woman who wants to be a great singer. And he promises her that he can do that, and he entrances her. He's hideous, he's strange, he's diabolical. It's a little bit like Phantom of the Opera to that extent. But he elevates her artistically to the point that she becomes the most famous and otherworldly singer in existence, except there's a problem. In order for her to go out to concerts every night, he has to entrance her, put her in a deep trance. And she has no memory of her performances. So other people will come up and tell her afterwards that you're amazing, I've never heard a voice like that before, the song you sing, and she has zero recollection of her own performance. Now, there's one other thing. She starts, I'm going to spoil it for you, but if you haven't read this story from the 19th century, the likelihood you're going to read it is low. Another thing about Svengali's trances there is that she starts coughing and starts having symptoms, and she discovers that his trances are killing her, that they're requiring such an expenditure, almost stealing sort of parts of her soul away every time she sings. So she's dying young, but she still wants to be the greatest singer in existence. But here's the interesting part that goes to what you said, Saj. This figure, who by the way is Drew Barrymore's grandfather, who plays him in the film, this is John Barrymore, does a phenomenal job with the eyes and everything like that. And I hate to go into popular culture, but just good for you to know, there's only one actor who studies these figures who are over the top in their expressions, melodramatic, and who tries to do that in popular culture and cinema today, and that's Nicolas Cage, in case you guys don't know. That's why a lot of people think he overacts. It's because he loves this era of theater where you had these magnified sort of hallucinatory figures. But here's the interesting, what does Svengali do? He takes her into a private inner sanctum where he trains her and he trances her, but then he makes her leave for most of the day. Why? So that she can encounter all these boring, mundane, simple-minded, untalented people throughout the day, so that 1 hour she spends with him becomes supernatural. By contrast, he creates the image after image of himself through the opposition. Does that make sense? If he had her just sit there all day long and they were like ordering pizza and playing video games and things like that, his aura would dissipate. He wouldn't have the after image effect. Does that make sense? So that's a careful thing to understand about these gestures as well. Cool. Michelle, what did you want to say, please?
I also, Michelle, just 1 second before she goes, we are towards the end. We have last 3 minutes left. So just as a, Michelle,
Sure.
please.
Oh, I wanted to mention along the lines of like whether or not insanity is contagious. Like Joseph Heller wrote a lot about that in Catch-22, but like there's this new philosopher, well, not philosopher, doctor, really, Dr. Gary Slutkin, who proved that violence is contagious. And he it moves as a contagious disease, it moves like a pandemic, and so I would argue that insanity can be contagious insofar as it is a response to violence, and so that because a lot of people who struggle with psychosis or any of this have experienced a violence episode predating that experience. So yeah.
Michelle, you're absolutely right. And this is something crucial to note. One of the things that I absolutely adore about Freud and about Freudian psychoanalysis is that he does not spare judgment on society and reality. He's living between World War I and World War II. Freud is absolutely convinced, and I agree with him, and you should all accept this, that what you call everyday society is absolutely fucking psychotic. Right? Absolutely pathological. In the most wretched senses of the word, right? They're insane. The people who rule your world from one country to another are insane. By definition, by prerequisite, you must be insane to be in the political universe of our current world, right? You have to believe in all kinds of other types of magical thinking, right? And all that we won't get into. The ceremonies that you see in every country, they're as old as the pyramids. This is what the pharaohs did, right? So there is no hierarchy to say that we are crazier than they. It's all madness at some level or another. It's just that we have to believe that our madnesses are more beautiful, more elaborate, more sophisticated, more worthwhile than their madnesses. But absolutely, Michelle, violence is madness. There's nothing, you cannot tell me, you cannot look at the Stalinist purges or concentration camps or ethnic cleansing that's going on as we are speaking and not tell me that is insane behavior.
Yeah,
Right.
and the cool thing is that the doctor who discovered that violence moves like a pandemic was actually an AIDS researcher. And so he was applying anti-AIDS anti-pandemic with the AIDS crisis rules to violence, and it worked. So and that's how he proved it. It was that because it responded like a virus, it was a virus, and so that was his logic. But yeah.
Well, this becomes then the terrible question. And last thing, sort of, I'll say to this then, is that are we saying that we are trying to heal the world? No, anybody who tried to heal radical negativities in the 20th century became genocidal maniacs. Right? Every utopia that was sold, every perfect world syndrome that was peddled out there became the ism that then killed and slaughtered tens of millions of people. So we shouldn't inhabit that delusion that we are healing the world of its madness. The problem is that it is a very one-dimensional, repetitive madness which is being imposed continually. Right? And by the way, it is the Jewish philosophers post-Holocaust, like Adorno and Walter Benjamin and the Frankfurt School, who understand that there is not that big a difference between capitalism and fascism and communism at the end of the day. That they're playing from the same scripts and the same playbooks of the Enlightenment, and their diagnosis theoretically is absolutely right when you look into it. Foucault says this too. He says Marx is in the Enlightenment like a fish in water, right? So these are Hydra heads. They're part of the same monstrosity. What you saw in World War II was not good versus evil. It was a family fight. It was an infight of a family. Three contending wives. Who were the opposites of the Italians, the Germans, and the Japanese? The British and the French, who were colonizing the whole world at the barrel of a gun? Stalin? This is your great, your great savior. And the US, where they were lynching African Americans and exterminating Native Americans like it was going out of style? Give me a break. This is not good versus evil. This is the same malady, the same affliction playing out in variations, biting at one another, like wolves in a pack, all feeding off the same carcass. If we are not that, I don't think that necessarily we are, again, the antidote or the cure or the pharmacon to all the fascisms of our world. We are alternative theaters. They will continue. I'm going to tell you the sad news. They will continue because they have always been there. But our kind, for Christ's sakes, has always been there too. Since the beginning. Falling in volcanoes, like Empedocles, being forced to drink poison, like Socrates, put up on a crucifix, right? Doesn't matter. We've always been there too. We've always been in the game. So we continue to take our shot. But we have to adapt and become more versatile because in some ways, they have stolen our arsenal and our weaponry. In the age of metaverses and virtuality and simulations and artificiality, that used to be our domain. We used to be the domain of the dream and the nightmares and the fantasies and the illusions. And now they have created pseudo-technological apparatuses to steal our space. So we just have to be better than them and faster than them. For next class, thank you, Ishida, for everything. For next class, go on the course site, see the example entries so you see the format. It's very simple. It's time, location, basic title, and then a descriptive paragraph. 3 to 5 sentences, 5 to 7 sentences, however much you want to write, focusing on the most unique details of what you found for next week for dream and nightmare. All right. I'm looking forward to seeing what you come up with. Take care, everyone.
Yeah. Bye. Thank you, Jason. Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Ciao, thank you.
Cheers.